right, thanks, Chris. And thank you to the tech guys who took care of this at the last minute. I really appreciate that. I would have been, it's a lot better with the slides. It's going to be better with the slides. So this talk is based on my new book called The Sexual State, How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along. We chose that title before all the sex scandals and stuff, which is kind of an unfortunate title perhaps at this moment. But actually what I mean to say is that the church's teaching has been right all along. And in fact, everything that's happening is proving that the church's teaching is sound. So we need to articulate it. And I actually think this is a very important moment for the church, and it's a very important moment for the faithful, for the truly faithful. How many of you are actually Texas natives? How many of you are from Texas? Okay. Okay, so you probably know, those of you who are from Texas probably realize that Texas, what happened? Used to be bigger than it is now, right? Y'all know that. That's Texas in 1836. I knew I could get a little, appreciation from you. What happened? Oh, I know what's happening. We got a delay. We got a lag here. Anyway, so that's great. That's nice, y'all Texans. But I just want to say, if you put into your Google search bar Louisiana map, 1750, okay, y'all, all right. So when I was visiting Minnesota earlier this year, I explained to them that they could all be honorary Cajuns, and they could come on down and we would feed them, you know. Okay, so I am getting a little satellite lag here. There we go. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so the sexual revolution is what I'm going to talk about. And the sexual revolution is in the news every day. Every day there's something new. And so if you want to be informed about these matters, you really need to follow us at the Ruth Institute. So we have a weekly newsletter. And my young friend, if you would pass around the sign-up sheets for the Ruth Institute newsletter, this comes out once a week. There's always something to talk about, okay? So if you can see the images that we have here, you know, various sexual problems that are in the news. And that photo up there, that's Judge Kavanaugh and his accuser. That's the latest, you know, new crisis that's out there. I had a different photo up there. You know, I mean, it's just there's always something going on, something that needs to be explained and understood. So I do hope you'll sign up for the Ruth Institute newsletter. Follow us on the Facebook page. I have my own personal blog. And also, if you will sign up for the newsletter, if you give me your email address here, I will send you these slides, okay? Because I always have way too many slides. And the slides also have on them references. So you don't need to scribble down everything now. You'll receive it, and then you can look it up and stuff later on. All right. So our mission is to help Christians, equip Christians to explain why we believe what we believe about marriage, family, and human sexuality. And by the way, am I loud enough in here? Is this loud enough? Okay, you all look like you can hear me. And as Chris mentioned, I was deeply involved in the Proposition 8 campaign. And one of the great benefits of that campaign was that we came to see that people across the different faith traditions really have a lot in common with one another on the issues that have to do with marriage and family and human sexuality. In fact, what we discovered is that the orthodox or traditional believers in every group had more in common with one another than they did with the liberal members of their own faith tradition. Okay, and so that was just kind of a neat thing that happened. And I came to realize that to really defend the family, we need to think of it in terms of as an interfaith effort. So everything that we do at the Ruth Institute is consistent with Catholic teaching, but we don't call ourselves a Catholic organization because what we're presenting is for everyone. And my position is that as Catholics, what we have is so valuable and so important to the world, we have no right to keep it to ourselves. We have no right to keep it to ourselves. Our friends and neighbors need to hear what the church has to say. And it's been very interesting to me over the years to see people from different faith traditions turning to me to say, Dr. Morse, why do we think this? You know, I mean, all these dear, dear Mormon people who are, they have such good morals and they're such good, decent people, but they cannot explain themselves a lot of the time, right? And so this is something that we have to offer, that we need to offer, okay? So we're counting on you, all of you, okay? All right, so, yeah, I mentioned this already. It's kind of an unfortunate subtitle. Now, here's what we're going to talk about. First of all, I'm going to explain what is the sexual revolution, and I break it down into 3 component parts, and we'll spend a few minutes on each one of those 3 component parts of the sexual revolution. Then I'm going to talk with you about how the sexual state operates. The sexual state is a thing, and that is the theme of this book, is that the toxic sexual culture that we see all around us did not just emerge out of nowhere. It's not like the culture changed. That is not really correct. It's more accurate to say that people with money, power, and influence wanted a certain thing to be going on, they have a certain vision of the world and how they think things should be, and they're using their wealth and their power and their influence to create that fantasy ideology and to bring it into being. And that's why I call it the sexual state. So we have to talk about how the sexual state operates so you can be aware of it and be watching for it. And then finally we'll talk a little bit about how you can help, about what you can do, what you can take away from this presentation so that you can be part of the solution to this very serious and very important problem. So let's go then and start talking about the sexual revolution. How I define this big blob, this big mass, this overwhelming thing called the sexual revolution. I break it down into 3 component parts. And that's what I'll explain here: the contraceptive ideology, the divorce ideology, and the gender ideology. So here's the idea that a good and decent society should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. Okay, do you recognize that as part of the world that we live in? A good society should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. That is what I call the contraceptive ideology. And that ideology is more significant than any technology. The technology is inanimate objects, okay, that sit on the shelf. But we assign meaning to them and we use them in a certain way. That's the ideology, and that's the part that's really significant. Secondly, we have the idea that a good and decent society should separate both sex and babies from marriage. So if you want to have sex without being married, if you want to have a baby without being married, that's all fine. That's all good. I call that the divorce ideology. And the underlying thought there is that kids are so resilient that it doesn't matter whether they're attached to their parents particularly. Okay? So we'll talk about the divorce ideology. And number 3, the third part of the sexual revolution, is that the differences between men and women are really not very significant. The differences that have to do with the human body are not very significant, and so therefore, a good and decent society should do everything possible to wipe out all differences between men and women, except those that the individual specifically chooses to bear. And that is what I call the gender ideology. So those 3 components, the contraceptive ideology, the divorce ideology, the gender ideology, that's what we'll touch on briefly, each one of those. I want you to know that each one of those 3 topics, I have a full 45-minute presentation on each one of them, and here's the link to them. This is a podcast, the Ruth Institute podcast series. You can find that and get much more detail. And also in this book, The Sexual State, the book is organized around those 3 themes. So there's 3 sections, 1 section for each of those 3 major ideologies. So there's plenty more detail from what I'm going to be able to discuss in our brief talks tonight. So let's talk about the contraceptive ideology. Basic idea here of the contraceptive ideology is that sex is normatively a sterile recreational activity. If you happen to have quirky lifestyle preferences, you can have sex and have a baby, okay? But the normal thing that everybody should be able to expect and act on is that sex is a sterile activity. And why? So that we remove all of the social and moral significance from sex so that we can have sex whenever we want. Sex is an entitlement. And that's what holds together the sexual predators that we have learned about in the last 6 months. That's what Harvey Weinstein and Theodore McCarrick have in common, okay? And all the other areas where we hear about the Me Too movement, whether it's in Hollywood or politics or the business world or the world of classical music, the stories of sexual predation are coming out, are bubbling up to the surface in all of these different areas of life, and now they're bubbling to the surface in the Catholic Church as well. But the thought that people have in common on all of these things is the idea, I get to do whatever I want sexually. That's what it's about. And in order for that to even be remotely plausible, you must have already sterilized the sexual act, right? So the many things are made possible by this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ashley Madison. This is a website for married people. It's a dating service for married people. Okay? Life is short, have an affair. Okay? And they have 41 million anonymous members registered on this website. This would be unthinkable if it were not for the thought that sex has already been sterilized. Right? It wouldn't even enter your mind to do a thing like that. Okay? So that's briefly about the contraceptive ideology. There's much more we could say about it, but I just want to give you a little taste for how significant that thought really is and how actually crazy it is. Okay? Now, let's talk about the divorce ideology. The divorce ideology comes down to the idea that kids don't really need their own parents. That's why it's okay to have sex outside of marriage and to have babies outside of marriage, because we think the kids are so resilient that it's really going to be okay. Okay? So we as adults, we're so emotionally vulnerable and fragile that we must be permitted above all to separate and repartner anytime we want for any reason we want, and the kids will be fine. The kids are so resilient, they're going to be fine. So that's the underlying idea. Let me say just a few words about that, because I think the divorce ideology is very significant. It's probably one of the things that has affected more people in this room than anything else. The Ruth Institute, and here I'm going to show you this, illustrate this by way of a contrast. The Ruth Institute's dream is that every child be welcomed into a loving home with a married mother and father. That's the Ruth Institute's dream. And I imagine it's your dream too, right? This is what the pro-life movement is working for. And at least in part, this is part of what we're working for. And we think this is what children deserve and need, are entitled to. The reason we have this dream is so that every child can have a relationship with his or her own parents unless some unavoidable tragedy takes place to prevent it, okay? Now sometimes when I talk about children having a right to their own parents, people will say, Dr. Morse, you forgot about adoption. And I'm like, no, there's no way I'm going to forget about adoption because my first child was adopted. As a matter of fact, he's the one who helped me figure this out because he had been profoundly neglected. And we brought him into our home. When we brought him into our home, he had already been through a lot. He had already been through more than most people in this room probably have ever been through, right? The age of 2.5. And so what we concluded from that experience, we had him, he came, then we gave birth to a little girl 6 months later. 2 kids in 6 months' time. It's a record even for a Catholic to do that. Actually, have you all heard about the 54-day novena that is being promoted? Okay. I did that 54-day novena over infertility, okay, y'all, and I ended up with 2 kids in 6 months. So that novena is good, okay? Y'all need to do that novena. Anyway, the point is, the best thing for our little boy would have been if none of this had ever happened to him. You know, we were good parents to him, and we love him, and we're glad he's part of the family and all that, and it takes nothing away from our family for us to admit, for all of us to say, it would have been better for him if it had never happened, and he could have stayed with his mommy and daddy. Adoption is a backup plan, and it's a great backup plan when an unavoidable tragedy takes place. I'm fed up with your father is not an unavoidable tragedy. Okay? You see the difference? All right? You could do something about that. So that every child can have a relationship with their own parents unless some unavoidable tragedy takes place to prevent it, and so that every adult, without exception, can know their identity, so that you can know who you are. You know your genetic identity, you know your cultural heritage. Even if you're adopted, you should be allowed to have an accurate birth certificate. No more falsifying birth certificates. Again, this is something that we feel strongly about at the Ruth Institute. When these rights are violated, we say that this is a structural injustice to the child. It is unjust to the child. It is unjust to deprive a person of a relationship with their own parents. It is unjust to deprive a person of the knowledge of their identity, to give them a falsified birth certificate. And as a result of these injustices, a lot of bad things happen to people, okay, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to just mention the two competing worldviews that are out there. The Ruth Institute says every child, and hence every adult, has identity rights and relational rights with respect to their parents. And, psst, psst, look up here. We don't like to say this part too loud, but those rights of children impose obligations on adults, which we don't like to mention because nobody likes obligation. The competing worldview is that every adult is entitled to the sexual activity they want with a minimum of inconvenience. And psst, 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 kids just have to accept whatever the adults choose to give them. We don't say that too loud because we'd be ashamed of ourselves if we just blurted it out like that. But that is approximately the position of the governments of all the so-called developed countries on this planet right now. That is approximately their position. So, come back here. Why is divorce so hard on kids? I want to just take a moment to talk about this. And again, there's a lot more detail in the book and at the Ruth Institute. But why is it so hard on kids? Well, so look at, here's what we tell the kids. And you've probably heard this. If you're going to get divorced, you're supposed to say to the children, Daddy and Mommy don't love each other anymore. We still love you, honey, but we don't love each other anymore. And so we're not going to live in the same house together. Well, in the child's mind, Mommy's half of who I am, Daddy's half of who I am. You're telling me you love me, but you don't love half of who I am. I can't make this work. I can't make this add up. Okay, and you're asking a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old to work out something that really can't be worked out. And you're leaving them with that thought. And then you're wondering why they're having trouble in school, or they're upset, or they can't sleep at night, and all these kind of things that happen to children of divorce. And this chart here, come back here, this chart here comes from a pamphlet that the Ruth Institute has put out just called Children and Divorce, and it's the result of many, many studies that have been done by sociologists and psychologists and doctors and people looking at the impact of family structure on the outcomes for children. And what you see is these are all different things that children of divorce are at risk for, at higher risk for, as a result of the breakdown of their family. Doesn't mean every child is going to experience every one of these things, obviously, but it's telling you, it's pointing you to the fact that this injustice that the kids have endured has some real teeth to it, right? It actually catches out to something significant. This is an article by one of our Circle of Experts members, Dr. Pat Fagan. He did this article called The Effects of Divorce on Children, and this is basically a research summary where he goes through and looks at 40 years worth of research on this topic. And it goes on in this vein for 40 closely typed pages with 330 footnotes, talking about the different problems that kids experience. And these are all, controlled studies of various kinds, right? This is not all junk. You don't have 40 pages of junk science here. All right, so we have this pamphlet, and then we have a pamphlet on children and same-sex parenting, which has some of the same issues and then some. Okay, so I want to mention at this time that there are some possibilities for divorce reform, and part of the reason I'm mentioning this is that you do have a state representative here in Texas, Matt Krause, who's very interested and committed to doing something about divorce reform. Among the possible things that you could do is you could do things that deal with the fact that most divorces are unilateral and not mutual. So the irreconcilable differences could be removed as a cause. You could require some form of genuine mutual consent. Shared parenting presumption, waiting periods, and my personal favorite divorce reform is that you could simply treat lying in family court as perjury. Anybody ever been in family court? I've heard people can't just candidly call it liar's court. Liar's court. Now, I'm sure someone somewhere has been penalized for lying in family court, but I've never heard of it. I have literally never heard of anybody getting in trouble. And people make up whoppers in family court. So just want to put that thought in your mind. And this man here in the front in the blue shirt who's filming me tonight, in addition to the university tech person, this is my friend Jeff Morgan, who's very active in divorce reform here in Texas. So if any of you are interested in that issue, pigeonhole him afterward, and I'm sure he'll be glad to talk with you. All right, so finally the gender ideology. Let's talk a little bit about the gender ideology. And again, we'll just scratch the surface here of what I mean by the gender ideology and the impact that it's had. Well, what is the gender ideology? In the old days, it was the idea that men and women were identical. And this is old school feminism from when I was your age, y'all's age. I can't believe I'm saying that. When I was your age. Anyway, this was the idea. Men and women are identical, except women are better. See, that was feminism back in the day, right? And I see you all know what I'm talking about, right? So, therefore, it's a moral imperative to wipe out all differences between men and women. And that is the thought that led to all kinds of things, including banning father-daughter dances, okay, which did happen, does happen. That's considered improper sexual stereotyping. But now we're to the point where we are requiring gender-neutral bathrooms. There's something, what in the world? It's somebody's phone. Okay, never mind, okay. I'm sure that won't come up on the tape. And we won't point out whose phone it was that went off or anything. Everybody take her picture. No, that's Ruth. I'm sorry. I haven't been in a classroom in a long time. You're bringing out this stuff here. Okay, so we've gone from banning father-daughter dances to requiring gender-neutral bathrooms. What in the world? How did this happen? So the new gender ideology is that the human body is so insignificant that we can wipe out all differences between men and women. It used to be that we were saying we would use social engineering we would reconstruct society to get rid of all of those differences. Now we're saying that you can reconstruct yourself, okay? And so we're wiping out all the differences except those that the individual specifically chooses to embrace. In either case, you're saying that the body is not really very important. And so we have the vision of Bruce Jenner. For those of you who may not know this, in 1976, Bruce Jenner was the Olympic decathlon winner, okay? So this is not like a wimp. This is like a very athletic man's man, okay? However, Bruce Jenner wants to be called Caitlyn now. And what I want you to notice about this photo, no matter how isolated you are and how much you protect your children, all you homeschool moms or whatever, that you're trying to isolate your children from the craziness of the culture, everyone has seen this image, right? You can't escape it. You cannot escape seeing this image. What I want you to notice is the stereotypical image of femininity, okay? Now, personally, I'm a woman. I've been a woman my whole life. I have never dressed like that. I'm looking out here, about half the audience is women. Nobody's dressed like that, okay? So this is some man's idea of what it means to be a woman. This is why a lot of the radical lesbian feminists are very angry with the transgender movement. I don't know if you know this, but the LGBT movement has a lot of rifts in it right now. The L's are kind of at war with the T's at the moment. So this is, I call this Clueless Bruce. This is Bruce Jenner saying the hardest part about being a woman is figuring out what to wear. I'm like, really, Bruce? Really? Childbirth, Bruce? You know? Come on, baby. You know, come on. Now, to be fair, he walked this back because a lot of people yelled at him about this. But these words came out of his mouth, okay? So it's a very stereotypical version of what it means to be a woman, which is what the earlier version of feminism was trying to get rid of. Now, in sports, we have this kind of contradictory situation going on with sports. Back in the day, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act was used to demand equality for women in sports. And what I mean by that, some of you may remember this, some of you may not remember this, but what happened was there was a period of time where the federal government interpreted Title IX of the Civil Rights Act to mean that at every college, university, and high school, it was required that there be an equal number of sports for men and women and an equal number of participants, of male and female participants in all the sports. Because we want to encourage women's participation in sports. And it's so important, it's so unfair if there aren't enough girls in those sports. So this was the federal government went around, what they did with this interpretation is they went around shutting down men's sports programs. And oddly enough, they didn't shut down the University of Texas Longhorns football program. Oddly enough, what they shut down was men's wrestling programs. Right? That was the target. That was on the mat all the time. And they turned dance into a sport because girls were interested in dance. So instead of dance being just dance, it's a competitive sport or something, see? And so they used this as the entree into regulating all of these aspects of things where you really shouldn't be too surprised that men and women want sports in different amounts and different intensities and stuff. You know, you wouldn't really be, a normal person shouldn't be surprised that there are differences here that have nothing to do with discrimination or unfairness or anything else. But this vision of the gender ideology said, by golly, we got to go in there and make sure those women have every opportunity to participate. Today, in the new dispensation of Title IX in the gender ideology, today what we have is that very same Title IX being interpreted to mean, not so much now under the Trump administration, but in the prior administration, Title IX was being interpreted to mean that every athlete could participate in the sport of which they identified. So a boy could participate, and still can, participate in girls' sports. Therefore, you have these guys here who say they're girls, and this guy won numerous girls' state championships in track and field. This guy is a professional boxer, and he went into a cage match, in a women's boxing match, and literally beat this woman senseless. And that was okay, because he identifies as a woman, okay? So what these two things mean, what does this mean? This is the end of women in sports, right? If you have to run in track and field and throw discus in a field event against a boy dressed as a girl, all the girls are going to actually lose. That's what's going to happen. So the very same piece of legislation is being interpreted in this new manner with a purpose that's absolutely contradictory to the earlier purpose of the same legislation. So it's really quite astonishing when you look at it from that perspective. So how do these visions of the gender ideology fit together? The human body is unimportant. That's what they have in common. The human body is unimportant and can be transcended either through social reconstruction or individual personal reconstruction with some combination of law and technology. You can become whatever gender you want to become. This, some of you who know your church history will recognize this as a high-tech version of Gnosticism, right? Because it's an attack on human embodiment. It is an assault on the limitations, it's resentment, really, of the limitations of the human body. So there's just one problem with the sexual revolution. We're supposed to separate sex from babies. That's a contraceptive ideology. However, look at the screen, boys and girls. Sex makes babies. Are we all good with that? I know y'all are not, this is not like a big empirical school, but y'all know sex makes babies, right? Okay, all right, that's good. All right, supposed to separate sex and babies from marriage, but kids actually do need their parents. Kids actually do need their parents. And we're supposed to wipe out differences between men and women, but men and women actually are different. The body is actually significant. What does this mean? The sexual revolution is completely irrational. It is impossible. However, for years we have argued this and gotten nowhere because we think we're done. We think at this point where we've explained that it's crazy that we're done. That's not true. They don't care that it's impossible. You understand? This is the point. This is the key point. Sit up, take notes. If you're going to take notes, this is the thing to write down. It is impossible. Therefore, it requires a lot of force to do the impossible. This thing cannot stand on its own. It needs force. It needs propaganda. It needs the sexual state in order to stay alive. If you believe, I'm losing my, okay. If you believe sex makes babies, this belief will be confirmed by reality on a regular basis. If you believe sex doesn't make babies and you try to build a whole society around the idea that sex doesn't make babies, you're going to have to do some work to make everybody believe that. You're going to have to do some work to tamp down all the evidence that keeps popping up. And that's one of the things I do in the book, is I spend quite a bit of time talking about that part of it. This is a totalitarian ideology that no Christian should have anything to do with. And the reason we are where we are with this thing is because we have been tap dancing around it for too long. We've been playing footsie with it, thinking we can accommodate it. We can, oh, it doesn't sound so bad. It's not, oh, they're just trying to be nice. All they want is this one little thing. No. This is a totalitarian ideology on par with every other totalitarian ideology you've ever heard of. So I'm going to do a short dramatic reading. Most Americans of faith thought that separation of church and state meant that the state had to leave faithful people alone. Come to find out, it finds that it means that the church must leave the state alone. The state permits us to have control over unimportant things, while it gets to control important things. And to add insult to injury, the state itself decides what counts as important. What then is the purpose of the sexual state? Perhaps you supposed that the purpose of the sexual state was the purpose of the government was to protect people from force or fraud, or to ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, or promote the general welfare. That is so 5 minutes ago. The real purpose of government today is to give people the sex lives they want with a minimum of inconvenience. You want to have sex without a baby? No problem. We'll give you contraception at no cost to you. You want to have an abortion and you want to have sex with somebody you aren't married to? That's okay. We'll give you a no-fault divorce so you won't be inconvenienced by your obligations to your spouse and children. You want to have sex with a person of your own sex and you want to have a baby? That's really inconvenient. We'll restructure the legal system and subsidize the technology that will make it possible for you to obtain all the babies you want without the inconvenience of having to deal with the child's other parent. Harsh? Maybe. Inaccurate? I don't think so. It's time we face the reality of the government under which we now live. We live in the sexual state. So, how does the sexual state operate? I'm going to say a few words about propaganda. It takes a lot of propaganda to keep this thing going. Now, around the country, we put on workshops called Healing Family Breakdown, because that's a big part of what we're concerned about is the pain and the grief of family breakdown. And every week, prior to the workshop, I will go out and look for current examples of propaganda supporting the sexual state. And I can always find something. So this past summer, I found this headline, this darling headline from the New York Times, why women had a better sex under socialism. Now, how they know this, I don't know. But this is in the New York Times in 2017. And look at this image that they put with us. They must have resurrected this image from back in the day when they were whitewashing the Ukrainian famines. Because look at this chubby, cheerful Russian peasant woman. All right? The New York Times has been whitewashing totalitarian regimes for a long time. So this is the image that they chose to put beside this fake news that women had better sex under socialism. Around the same time, there was an article in Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue, a magazine marketed to middle schoolers, called, as you can see on the screen, and I have no illustration to this, though there were illustrations in the magazine, Anal Sex, What You Need to Know. Do you know what middle school girls need to know about anal sex? Nothing! They need to know nothing about it. Come on. And so on. I mean, you know, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Oh, here, this is a good one. Let me just show you this last one. Come on back. Come on back. One more. Well, maybe. There we go. This one. This one's from 1968. Walt Disney Productions made a cartoon in cooperation with the Population Council on explaining why contraception was just fine. Okay, in 1968. That's how long this has been going on. It had Donald Duck in it. You can look this up online. Okay, so propaganda is a very important part of how the sexual state operates. The other part that's very important that I particularly want to call to your attention is that it is absolutely necessary to silence the victims. It is absolutely necessary that we never, ever admit that there's any problem. We came out with this pamphlet. I didn't bring any with me on this occasion, but it's called, Do You Know a Survivor of the Sexual Revolution? That's a rhetorical question. Everyone knows a survivor of the sexual revolution. And in that pamphlet, we talk about the children of divorce, reluctantly divorced people, refugees from the hookup culture, that is to say, people who've participated in the hookup culture and realize it's awful and that they have been lied to and they don't want to have anything to do with it. Likewise, the gay lifestyle. People who have walked away from their participation in the sexual revolution because it didn't turn out the way it was promised to turn out. And so it's very important that these victims be disappeared, right? That you never hear about them. So contraceptive ideology, I would say that women who postpone childbearing until they're 35, they have a rude surprise when they find out that they can't have 10 kids that they wanted if you don't start till you're 35. That was my thought process. And I'm good at math, right? And I was still thinking that. So the post-abortive woman, the cohabitors with regrets, people, have you ever known anybody, maybe you guys are all innocent, so maybe you don't know anybody like this, but I bet the clergy here have heard this confession. Somebody who lived with a boyfriend for 5 years, 10 years, and then it didn't work out, and then she woke up and realized her peak fertility years had been wasted on a guy who wasn't really interested in her. Have you ever seen that in a sitcom or a movie? In Teen Vogue, do they ever tell people about that? No, see, but there are millions of these people, and you got to keep them all quiet. Otherwise, the fantasy ideology would go away. Okay, so now I want to just throw one little thing out here about the sexual abuse issues. On that pamphlet that we put together, it doesn't say anything about people who have been sexually abused. I never wanted to deal with sexual abuse, right, because no one wants to deal with it. You know, honestly, it's awful, it's icky. I thought, well, I have enough other things to deal with. I have all these other issues to deal with. But now that all of this is coming out and I'm looking at it, I can see that what the sexual revolution really is gravely culpable in all of these different places where sexual abuse has been so institutionalized, where everyone knew and nobody did anything. Why? Because the sexual revolution, that ideology, created cover. It created cover for people to get away with what they were getting away with. And in addition to that, we have the things that the pro-life movement knows very well, that abortion becomes the instrument by which the evidence of the crime can be wiped out, right? And pro-life people are very well aware of that sometimes an abusive person brings a girl in for an abortion so that nobody finds out what she's doing, what's being done to her, and the person is put back into the abusive situation. So all of these things, it's all a part of the same package is what I'm trying to say. What can we do about this? What can we do about it? What can we do to help? So first step is you've got to inform yourself. So you need to understand the sexual revolution. Basically, I want you to be able to identify the propaganda because it's everywhere. Once you start to pay attention to it, it's everywhere. So I have order forms for this book. I only brought one copy, so I can't sell them. I mean, I sell this one. But I've got order forms over there, and if you just tuck $25 into the envelope, I'll ship it to you. You know, fill it out, fill out the card. We'll mail it to you, pay the postage and all of that. So it's a special for tonight. But I do think you'll get a lot out of this book. Then I've been very concerned about what's been happening in the church, and I imagine all of you are too. I mean, it's one thing to find out that there's corruption in Hollywood. It's another thing to find out that it's going on right within our own mother, our Holy Mother, the Church. So I've been thinking about what we can do as ordinary people, because we're ordinary people, and there are a lot of us, right? So if there's something we could do, that would be really important to get done. So I came up with this acronym of what we might do to improve the overall situation that has to do with sexual abuse, but also with the sexual revolution more generally. And so I say that changing the playing field here, changing the culture, is a shoe-in. And SHOE is an acronym for 4 steps, okay? And I'm going to go through these briefly. Support, holiness, organize, and educate. Now, support, here's what I'm thinking about, support. we need to support people who've been victimized. And we need to support the whistleblowers, because we're finding out now, are we hearing these stories about guys who tried to say something was wrong and, you know, were sent to the church equivalent of Siberia or something, you know? I mean, we're hearing these stories. We're hearing about housekeepers and church secretaries who knew something was wrong but were afraid to say anything, right? Because they would lose their job and they needed their job. So what we can do, what all of us can do and need to do, is we need to be listening to these people. We need to listen to what they have to say, and we need to support them, okay? So if they're victims, we have to take them seriously. When we're looking at some of these older cases, what we find out is that they weren't taken seriously. The little boy would go home and say, "Mommy, Father McCarrick did something bad to me," and nobody believed him, right? Or people said, "Oh, it's fine, you'll get over it, it's not that big of a deal." So that's got to stop, right? That's got to stop, obviously. For the whistleblowers, some of these people are going to need another job. Some of them are going to need a house, right? If they get kicked out of the rectory or whatever it is, you know, that people are going to need material support from one another. So I want you to have in your mind that if you hear of such a thing, are you and your parents able to help connect this person to somebody who can help them? Can you get them a job? Can you write them a letter of recommendation because you know them, and that way they're not dependent upon their superior or whoever it is that might be continuing to give them a hard time. So that's a part of the picture. So the S stands for support. Now, listening to the victims and the whistleblowers is part of it, and I do mean listening to them. And this is not just sexual abuse, by the way. Everybody in our little pamphlet, all of the people who have been through like adult children of divorce, okay, that's not sexual abuse. People who've been reluctantly divorced, their spouses left them, but they wanted to stay married, right? We need to listen to them, and we need to help them connect the dots between what's happening to them now and the suffering and the ideology that they all embrace. Because a lot of these vulnerable people, if we'll be patient with them and listen to them and not insist that they become full-on Humana Vitae Catholics the first minute we talk to them, but we just work with them, help them connect the dots, we can be a big service to them. And friendship is really important. So, yeah, keep listening even if you are creeped out by what they are telling you, right? Some of what we hear is not very nice. So I want to give you this example. Did any of you see this photograph? This is in the New York Times article, in which this young man, the young man in the yellow swimming trunks there, revealed that Father McCarrick began abusing him sexually when he was 11 years old. He was 11. This photo is out of their family album because everybody thought, oh, Father McCarrick is such a good influence on our troubled boy. Well, they didn't realize why he was troubled. He was troubled because he was being sexually assaulted at the age of 11. Nobody believed him. So, you know, what if people had listened? At least his little life would have been different, right? So we created this little petition that, you know, you can sign, and it just says, "We believe you. We believe you." I mean, he spent his whole life with nobody believing him. He only told his sister like in June, and she didn't know. This man's 60 years old now. That's how long this is going on. So anyway, it's a small gesture, but hopefully important. Okay, holiness. Everybody knows we have to pray and fast. Okay, you hear that all the time. Okay, right, yeah, we got to pray and fast. But let's be a little focused here. There is an idea that needs to go, that needs to be gone, purged out of our culture, and that is the idea that sex is an entitlement. That has got to go. Now, what does that have to do with you and me and our personal holiness? Well, a lot of us have sexual sins in our past. A lot of us have sexual misconduct in our past of various kinds. Many people of my generation, you guys, you're at a great school, you're in a nice Catholic environment. I wasn't. I rejected the church because I was really smart, you know, and I knew better, right? So I stormed out of there and thought I'll never go back. And so, of course, I came back to the church because I figured out the church was right about sexual issues, right? I mean, the church was right all along. This is the story of my life. Anyway, why am I telling you this? Oh, I know why I'm telling you. Because, let's see. Yeah, this is the picture I want you to see. Do you guys know what this Women's March on Washington was? Do you guys remember this? Some of you remember it. Even if you're very sheltered, this probably came into your world somehow. These women marched on Washington, and they all wore little pink knitted hats that were supposed to be pink pussy hats. Okay, and they're protesting abuse of women this way. Okay, they're protesting. This is their idea of a Me Too movement. This is how we're going to cultivate respect for women, is going around in pink pussy hats. Here's the problem. Okay. They are not willing to let go of the very things that are driving the sexual abuse. They're hanging on to their pills. They're hanging on to their pornography and to their idea that they want to be sex positive, right? They're hanging on to things they shouldn't be hanging on to, right? And so we as Catholics, we're the ones who've been letting go of all that stuff. So if you've got any of that in your past, you need to release it. You need to be sorry. You need to go to confession. You know, those of us who are older, who've been through this, you know, every once in a while you're going to need to say to people, and I'll say to you all right now, that I know from experience that the church is right because I did all these harebrained things, okay? I lived with my boyfriend, 2 different boyfriends. I was married. I was divorced. I had an abortion. I did all this crazy stuff. That's how I know it doesn't work. You see how I just did that? You know, did that look hard? It was not hard. You know why it's not hard? Weekly confession. That's why it's not hard, right? You just say repeatedly, I was wrong. I was wrong. I was wrong. And then it just rolls off your tongue. And then you don't have to sit down and do I tell my son everything I did? No. Just tell him in a general way, I did some stupid stuff. Don't do it, okay? I mean, parents are afraid. Parents are afraid. Seriously, parents are afraid. If I tell what I did, they'll think it's okay, or they'll think I'm a hypocrite. Yeah, no. You don't go into detail. They're not interested in the detail, are you? You're not interested. No, you guys are not interested in the detail. Okay, you don't have to go there. But I do think what's going to happen is going to make your witness more credible if you will let go of those things you're holding on to. For me, it was contraception. That was the thing I held on to the longest, right? But we need to release all of those things. So I won't belabor that point. But I also think we need to tell the whole story of the sexual revolution and not just the little corners we don't like. This is, again, something I learned in Prop 8. I'll just tell you this one little story. In Prop 8, it was political campaign, so we had 3 talking points we were allowed to talk about. Now, I was always going off message. You know, I was a problem. I was a problem child. But anyway, one time, the very first thing I had to do was I went up to Los Angeles and I spoke to the editorial board of the Los Angeles Times and trying to convince this room full of people who hated our guts that they should endorse Prop 8, right? So one of the things I did is I had a birth certificate from Canada, because by that time Canada had already redefined marriage, and so the birth certificates look different. That's the first thing that has to happen, is you have to redo the birth certificates. Of course, nobody wanted to talk about that you have to redo the birth certificates. But anyway, birth certificate, British Columbia at that time, it had a place for the child's name, a place for the mother's name, and then where the father's name would have been, there was a checkoff box, and it said father or co-parent, and you could check off one or the other. Okay, and I showed that to the editor of the Los Angeles Times, and I said, look, fatherhood is being undermined here. This is undermining children's need for a father and the position of the father in the family. This is terrible. This is going to be bad for everyone. We can't do this. She goes, she threw it away. She goes, a lot of kids don't have fathers. And I'm like, and how's that working for us? You know, and I'm sitting there realizing. And in retrospect, you can really see it, that because we let so many things go by, the move to redefine marriage to make it a genderless institution, that was not that hard for people. That was not a reach for people by the time we had let those kind of things go by. And unless we as a political movement were willing to say, hey, you know what, you're right. You're right. We're against divorce. We're against single parenthood. We're against all these things that separate children from their parents. But political people don't want to do that, right? I mean, that's just, so I left politics and formed the Ruth Institute, and we say that crazy stuff all the time, right? But it's more credible. But, you know, people will think, you know, you're wild and crazy and you're really out there and, you know, no one's listening to you, but it's a coherent position. The Catholic position is a coherent position, you guys, and we need to defend all of it. Don't just take one little corner of it and pretend that that's going to be good enough. It's not going to be good enough. All right, organize ourselves. Now, who are we going to organize? we're going to organize the victims and survivors of the sexual revolution, among other people. You guys are going to get organized too. I got something for y'all to do. But think about it. How many children of divorce are there? There have been about 1 million per year. Reluctantly divorced persons, those are the people who wanted to stay married, but their marriage disappeared because that's how the courts work, right? Refugees from the hookup culture, ex-gays, so-called ex-gays. These are people who are socially and culturally invisible. What we want to do, what we think is the right strategy, is to get those people together, give them a voice, and tell them that they and their experience matters, and that their story matters, and that people need to hear what happened to them so that they will know not to go do this same stupid stuff, and which you don't figure out is stupid until you've made a mistake that you can't recover from, right? You think about, well, you can think about it a little bit. Some of you know what I'm talking about from experience, but you can work it out. These are not small errors, right? These can be life-changing errors. So those of you who are involved in pro-life work are aware probably of the post-abortive woman as being kind of a thing in the pro-life movement. She's one instance of this general proposition that I'm talking about. This is a woman. I snapped this photo at the San Diego Walk for Life one year. Look at this woman. She's in her 60s, sitting there with that sign saying, "I regret my abortion." Her witness is powerful, right? Because she's saying, you're not getting the whole story. The story that's being told to you that this is harmless, that's not the whole story. You need to hear that. So she's making a difference, and you probably know that that part of the pro-life movement is a very significant part of it. We need to replicate that for all of the other victims of the sexual revolution. And those of you who have suffered while watching other people go through this, maybe you haven't done it yourself, but you're watching your brother, your sister, your cousin, you count as victims and survivors of the sexual revolution as well. So to organize, here's the simple way to get ourselves organized. How many of you are already in a prayer group or Bible study at this school? Come on. Come on, fellas. You got it. Okay, a lot of people have weekly rosary groups, prayer groups, Bible studies that they go to. I would ask you, first of all, if you're not in one, you need one. Okay, just under the holiness thing, you guys, you need that. Okay, so that's point one. But point two, if you're doing that, I would ask that you add this one little touch to what you're already doing, which is give yourself some little thing to read every week about the sexual revolution, whether it's an article about transgenderism or divorce or something like that. Read it and discuss it. Take an extra 10 minutes on your meeting and educate yourself. And now you are spending time thinking about these issues, preparing yourself to do something about it, and you've got your little list, right? And if so, those two things: one, read, do the little bit of reading. Do I have it on here? Discuss it, and then save time at your meeting for people to talk about whatever's going on that may need your attention. So right now, it's a big thing going on. Drag Queen Story Hour. Have you all heard about this? Okay, completely nuts. People need to be organized at the local level to go deal with their library, right? Or to deal with your school board or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be something national. In fact, we need people doing stuff at the local level where these things are coming up and being implemented. And there are a lot of bad people who are very well organized. There's no reason good people can't be organized too. I'm just saying, right? Is there any prohibition on good people being organized? I'm looking at my fathers here. That would be okay? All right, so you see, it's okay. All right, so we've got stuff that you can use. You know, we've got materials and stuff like that. That's not important. The important thing is that you do something, right? You do something. And then the E, of course, just stands for educate. Educate yourself, because this is all part of the process that you educate and equip yourself. So just add the organizing and education component to the meetings that you're probably, a lot of you are already having. So the final battle, we have heard from Sister Lucia, that the final battle will be over marriage and the family. The final battle between the Lord and the kingdom of Satan will be about marriage and the family. Whoever works for the sanctity of marriage and the family will always be fought against and opposed in every way, because this is the decisive issue. When she said that in the 1980s, I think it was, who knew what she was talking about? but now it's completely clear that this is true. So therefore, I do hope that all of you will get involved and stay involved. Thank you very much.